Guys, so recently I've noticed that Powercreep has started to become more and more prevalent in Genshin Impact to the point where I've made way more videos about it than I originally thought I would. Now because I don't want to repeat the same things in this video as I have in my other videos, I'll just give you the short version of Powercreep to give a little bit of context. In short, Powercreep in Genshin Impact is fairly linear and only has some exceptions like myriad and Skirk. Now what this means is that each year, the power ceiling grows by a similar amount each time, and although this does seem far better than other forms of power creep, like the form of power creep in HSR, where the power ceiling increases by pretty much 100% every year, this form of power creep still makes it so that really old characters, like characters from Mondstadt, Inazuma or Sumeru, can participate in endgame modes, unless they're given buffs like how HSR is giving buffs to their old characters, which it seems like the Genshin devs are doing, but not in the same way that HSR is doing it. At least, not in the exact same way. You see, HSR buffs old characters indirectly by releasing new and powerful supports, or sets, which can be seen by Jean Juan's perseverance in the meta. But recently, they've also been taking a more active and direct approach by increasing the old characters' stats and giving them new abilities that synergize with other meta characters, which is definitely far better than just releasing new and powerful supports like how Genshin has recently started to do. But why is HSR's method of preventing power creep way better than Genshin's method of preventing power creep? And why is Genshin's method even worse in the first place? In this video, I'll be answering those questions along with others of a similar nature, while also providing examples of bad methods and good methods at solving power creep from both Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail. So to start it off, I'd like to go over the recent examples of Genshin Impact's method of preventing new characters from power creeping old ones. Recently, it seems like the Genshin devs have been releasing a really broken support that revitalizes a lot of old units, but then they release a horrendous DPS that is only viable if you summon on that new support. For example, Escoffier revitalized pretty much every Cryo and Hydro character, and she did this while being a really powerful character even outside of a Skirk team or a Mono Hydro and Cryo team, which is why Escoffier herself has a pretty cool kit. But right after Escoffier, they released Skirk, who's a horrendous DPS without Escoffier and an unplayable DPS when she's in a team without Mono, Hydro, and Cryo units like Escoffier. Another example could be Inefa, who is an amazing lunar charged sub DPS that can pretty much be slapped onto any team with a Hydro character and provide a ton more damage for that team, which, similarly to Escoffier, is really cool. But after Inefa, the devs are going to release Flins, who is horrendous, similarly to Skirk, since without Inefa, Flins loses a significant amount of his DPS because he requires another Notcry character and a ton of lunar charge sub DPS and buffs, which as of right now, only Inefa can provide. Another example could be Lauma, who is an amazing Bloom reaction based support that can be slapped onto any Bloom reaction based team and amplify the damage to meta levels. But right after her, the devs are going to release Nefer, who is going to be the first lunar Bloom dedicated DPS that's going to be dependent on Lauma, since Lauma is the only character that can provide a ton of buffs to the lunar bloom damage. Now, why are these synergies a bad method of preventing power creep? Well, first of all, these synergies are a bad method of preventing power creep because by making Escoffier, Inefa, and Lauma all such powerhouses, you lock the viability of every Hydro and Cryo character from every player that doesn't want to summon on Escoffier for whatever reason. You lock the viability of every character whose best teams are in Bloom reaction based teams from players that don't want to summon on Lauma, again for whatever reason. Lock the viability of every character that heavily benefits from really powerful sub DPS and lunar charge from players that just don't want to summon on Inefa. Escoffier should have never had to have revitalized Hydro and Cryo characters in the first place. Escoffier should have just been a really good single target Cryo applicator and sub DPS that synergizes perfectly with Furina. Lauma shouldn't have had to revitalize any DPS that depends on Bloom reaction based buffs. Lauma should have just been a Bloom support and Dendro applicator that introduces Lunar Bloom. And Inefa didn't have to, well, she doesn't even revitalize any old characters, she really just locks the viability from Flins. Regardless, Inefa should have just been a good Electro sub sub-DPS an applicator that introduces lunar charge, and that's it. They shouldn't have had to carry every Hydro and Cryo character, every bloom reaction based team, or any team that benefits off of lunar charge for them to be pull worthy. They could have easily just been another Cryo offfielder or support, a bloom support, or an Electro sub-DPS that people who lacked that type of archetype could have summoned on. But now, because they're so powerful, people who don't even want Escoffier, Lauma, or Inefa are forced to summon on them if they want their old units to be viable. And weirdly enough, they also have to summon on Escoffier, Lauma, or Inefa if they want their new units to be viable as well, which is the second reason for why this method of preventing power creep also sucks. At least to me, it seems like recently they've been making new DPS units unusable without their dedicated supports, not just because Wuthering Waves and HSR are also doing it, or because that's just a very common and simple marketing strategy for a gacha game, but because they're also trying to prevent the power ceiling from rising even further. You see, if they released Escoffier as powerful as she is now, and then released Skirk with the same level of power as your typical Natling character, well then we'd be fucked. But if they release Escoffier with the same level of power that she has now, and then they release Skirk with the same level of power as those really old Cryo and Hydro units that Escoffier is meant to revitalize, well then now the devs can make both the new units and the old units do the same level of damage, which would technically stop power creep in its tracks. And obviously the same thing applies to Lauma and Afer, and especially Flint and Inefa, which it seems like a lot of people don't understand, since a lot of people have expressed annoyance at the fact that Flint is so bad without Inefa. But again, if they were to have given Flint the same level of power as someone like Verisa, and then they released Inefa with the same level of power as she has now, well then Flint would unironically be reaching numbers on par with the Pyro Archon, which at least to me screams power creep and is a big no-no. Now obviously they could also just not release Escoffier, Inefa, or Lama with that same level of power, and instead just release the DPS character with the same level of power as a Natling character without their dedicated supports. But this wouldn't work either, since it would cause the old units to not get revitalized, which would just lead us back to power creep. So because of this, I honestly think that from a greedy gacha company perspective, this method of stopping power creep is kind of a big brain marketing strategy, since it stops power creep by buffing old characters so that they have the same level of power as new characters, and at the same time it incentivizes players to summon on the new supports so that the new DPS don't have the same level of power as the old DPS before they got buffed by the new supports. Still, no matter how big brain it may be, it's still a bad method at solving power creep, since this method outright refuses to just directly buff old characters, which is really stupid, since if they really wanted to stop power creep, they could have just done what HSR is doing and directly buffed the old characters. But instead, they want to use this indirect, complicated, and predatory method of stopping power creep, which makes it so that now we have a ton of units that just suck unless you summon on 3 specific supports, which is so unnecessary and honestly a shame, since again they could have just directly buffed the old units and released new DPS characters that weren't so dependent on the new supports, while also balancing out the new supports so that they're not absolutely broken, which would have maintained the linear increase of power creep that they've had over the years that gave Genshin Impact the reputation of being power creep free among the gacha community. Now, for the third reason for why Genshin's method of preventing power creep is a really bad method, I'll briefly go over the nuances of the viability of characters and how it relates to the relation between the average power ceiling and the HP of enemies. Okay, so if the Genshin devs make it so that every old and every new character has the same level of DPS if they are paired up with one specific support, and also make it so that that DPS character loses out on a ton of DPS if they don't have that new support, well then now the only difference between a character being meta or a character being unusable is if they do or don't have the new support, and thus the term meta and the term usable become synonymous. Abyss. This will happen because the terms meta and unusable typically refer to if a character can beat an enemy in time to reap all of the rewards in the Spiral Abyss, or if a character can't even beat an enemy in the Spiral Abyss. Now here's the thing, beating an enemy in the Spiral Abyss is dependent on their HP, which is dependent on the average power ceiling. For example, even though myriad can do upwards to 140,000 DPS, that amount of DPS isn't normal, and thus it's not considered as part of the relative power ceiling, which means that the HP of enemies does not accommodate for that level of DPS. Instead, the HP of enemies accommodates for the DPS of a larger amount of recent characters, like Natling characters, whose DPS is typically around 100k to 110k. Thus, as of right now, the HP of enemies accommodates for a DPS that is around 100k to 110k, like the majority of Natling characters, not 140,000 like an exception that is myriad. So if the majority of characters are now assumed to be able to do the same amount of damage, let's say 150,000 DPS, since technically every character will be able to do the same amount of damage if they have one of the handful of new supports, well then the HP of enemies will be raised to accommodate for that. But if that were to happen, every player that doesn't have one of those handful of new supports wouldn't have any DPS character that could reach that DPS, since their old characters suck and now their new characters also suck without the new handful of powerful supports. Anyways, now that I've gone over the examples of Genshin's method of preventing power creep and gone over the reasons for why it's bad, I'll now go over the recent HSR buffs that represent the good method of preventing power creep. Recently, the HSR devs buffed Blade, Kafka, Silverwolf, and Jingliu to the point where Blade and Jingliu are both viable DPS that have the ability to reach meta levels of performance, depending on what bosses they're facing and what teammates they have. For example, recently Jingliu hasn't been doing too well in MLC, since she can only beat one phase of MLC 12 in more than 7 cycles, which definitely isn't T0 performance. But in a recent MLC, she was able to beat one phase of MLC 12 in less than 5 cycles, which was even faster than what even Castris was doing. Now, these performances were only achievable because she was being ran in a team filled with meta supports like Hyacinth, Tribby, and Sunday, and her performance would have significantly dropped if she was being ran with even T0.5 supports like Ruanmei and Silverwolf, which is definitely the same problem of DPS characters being dependent on the new support characters, like the problem that is happening in Genshin Impact. But the extent of this problem is nowhere near as bad as in Genshin Impact, since Tribby and Hyacinth were only able to synergize with Jingliu so well because she got changed from an attack scaler to an HP scaler after her buff, meaning that Jingliu's meta performance is still heavily tied to her getting direct buffs, rather than being exclusively tied to indirect buffs given by meta supports, like what's happening in Genshin. Not only that, but unlike in Genshin, where you either get Escoffier or your Cryo and Hydro units don't even have a chance at floor 12 of the Spiral Abyss, Silverwolf, Ruanmei, Cypher, Robin, and RMC are all powerful replacements to Tribby and Sunday that would allow Jingliu to easily clear MLC 11, which, relative to Genshin, MLC 11 is a lot closer to floor 12 of the Abyss than MLC 12 is. This is even shown by the fact that both MLC 11 and floor 12 provide you with similar rewards when fully clearing them, which shows that even though Jingliu's performance isn't T0 level without dedicated supports, because she wouldn't be able to clear MLC 12 without them, it doesn't mean that her performance is not still meta, since clearing MLC 11 is considered T0.5 levels of performance, which is still considered meta. Now, for Silverwolf and Kafka, Silverwolf has been turned into an actual viable and even meta supports in some game modes. But Kafka, well, Kafka still suffers from the restrictive playstyle curse, which can be seen throughout HSR with the restrictive follow-up attack playstyle and break playstyle. But that's a whole other rabbit hole video that I really don't want to get into. Point is, Kafka is really powerful, but only with specific characters, to the point where on paper, her buffs are pretty impressive and show how directly buffing units and allowing them to synergize with present meta characters is a far better method of stopping power creep than restricting old and new characters' viability by locking it behind a handful of new supports like with Genshin Impact. But these buffs fail in practice, since HSR still can't get away from restrictive playstyles for some reason. Anyways, in conclusion, the buffs given to old characters in HSR has propelled them to the point where they're actually viable with a variety of powerful supports and even meta level with premium supports, with some exceptions like with Kafka, but not because there's a problem with directly buffing old characters as a method of stopping power creep, but because there's a problem with the fact that the HSR devs can't stop making restrictive playstyles, which is literally the same problem as restrictive DPS characters in Genshin, aka Flynn's, Nefer, and Skirk, whereas with Genshin, by releasing a new support that makes old and new DPS characters as powerful as each other, the Genshin devs are making it so that a vast amount of characters are horrible unless you get one specific support for them, in which case, even though technically every character now has the potential to be meta, and thus there will be no more power creep, at the same time, now the term meta and the term usable mean the same thing. Anyways, I think I'll end the video right here since there's not much else I can say without making this video even longer than what it was supposed to be. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have anything to say, feel free to leave it down in comments below. I would greatly appreciate it. Goodbye.